In chapter 33, we're going to be looking at the endocrine system, talking about hormone and peptide hormones, what they do, and which glands produce them. Right. So first of all, just what are hormones? So by definition, they are chemical signals made by the body. They're stable enough to be transported in an active form from where they're made. So typically they are made in one location and they typically act in a distant site. So they get made one place, taken to work somewhere else. So most of them are made in glands that are completely enclosed in a tissue, and those are referred to as endocrine glands because they are producing hormones. Again, they make them, release them, and they go somewhere else to do their job. So what are these glands of the endocrine system? So some of the main ones, the hypothalamus, we'll talk a little bit more about the pineal gland, pituitary gland, those are all in the brain. And then moving down, we have the thyroid and the parathyroid glands that are attached to the thyroid, but they act individually. Then there's the thymus that's close to the chest. Then down around the kidneys, we have the adrenal glands. And then the pancreas, we'll talk a lot about it as far as diabetes. And then the reproductive glands, we have the ovaries in females and the testes in males. All right, so how do these hormones, what kind of advantage do they offer over those electrical signals? So we talked about electrical signals with the nervous system. So one neuron releases or uses an electrical signal, then of course they release neurotransmitters and then they act on the next cell. So what are the advantages to these chemical hormones? So first of all, these molecules can spread to all the tissues in the blood. So electrical signals can't be transported or transmitted in the blood. Also, the signals can last a lot longer because once the chemical's made, it's there until it's degraded. Electrical signals diffuse away and don't last very long. Also, there are a lot of different types of chemicals that can act as hormones. There's only one electrical signal. It produces electricity or it doesn't. Whereas with hormones, we can have a lot of different types of them, and each one can be specific. So each hormone can influence a specific target cell by binding to a specific receptor. So they're very selective, again, unlike electrical signals that just kind of go wherever. Now, in the neuroendocrine system, this is just indicating how closely related the brain is to the endocrine system. Okay, so how does a gland know when to make the hormone? Well, that's controlled by the nervous system. So again, the endocrine gland makes a hormone, but it doesn't just always do that. It has to be told to, and that's the job of the nervous system. So the endocrine system and the motor nervous, remember the motor nervous are those neurons that are sending signals from the brain. So the brain is sending a signal to the endocrine system, and then that CNS controls or commands the organ. So because they're so closely related and kind of act as one unit, it's referred to as the neuroendocrine system. Because again, you don't get the release of hormones without a signal from the brain. And then the main switchboard in the brain that controls that is the hypothalamus. So it's kind of the main part, the main activity in the brain that controls a lot of the endocrine system and a lot of the glands. Now the chain of command, as far as that goes, so again, the CNS is regulating the hormones through this. So an example of how this works, again, the hypothalamus is kind of the main control system. So it controls the pituitary gland, also there in the brain, with releasing what's called thyrotropin releasing hormone. So then that causes the release of thyrotropin, hence the name, or it can also trigger the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. A lot of times these are abbreviated just to help in writing them so we don't have to write them out all the time. But then that thyroid stimulating hormone causes the thyroid gland to release its thyroid hormones. So again, the hypothalamus activates the pituitary, then the pituitary activates the thyroid. So you kind of have this domino relay effect of how this is working. So the hypothalamus also secretes, though, inhibiting hormones. So not all hormones are going to activate a gland. Some of them are going to inhibit it and tell it to stop producing hormones. So there needs to be both activation and inhibition. Now, the different types of hormones, there are proteins or polypeptides. There are also glycoproteins, which have a little sugar part attached to the protein. There are amines, and there are also steroid hormones that we'll talk about. So this path of communication then that the signal takes, so it has essentially 4 main steps. So first of all, we have to issue the command. That's, again, the job of the hypothalamus that we just talked about. So it ultimately controls the release of a hormone. Then that signal or that hormone has to be transported. So that's the job of the blood. Okay, so the pituitary or another endocrine gland releases a hormone. That hormone gets released into the blood. Then it needs to hit a target. The target is a receptor, and that receptor, depending on the type of hormone, is either inside of the cell or it's embedded on the plasma membrane. So we'll talk about those coming up. And then ultimately, the point is to have an effect. So the binding of the hormone to the receptor then causes that protein to have some type of change that triggers a change in cell activity. So whether that's taking up glucose, or it is changing the release of water or sucking up water, again, it's doing something. So first we need to issue the command from the hypothalamus, then this hormone gets transmitted through the blood, it hits a receptor on a cell, and then causes that cell to do something. So this is using the antidiuretic hormone just as an example of how this communication occurs. So again, the first step is that there needs to be receiving some sensory information to issue that command. So in this case, the signal is that there's dehydration. So the cells are communicating through activation of these osmoreceptors. They're saying, hey, something's out of whack, our water balance is incorrect. So the hypothalamus gets activated, and the hypothalamus essentially receives the signal saying, hey, we're dehydrated. So now the hypothalamus is going to command, so it's going to cause the release of antidiuretic hormone, ADH, from the posterior pituitary. Right, so the hypothalamus sends the command to the pituitary saying, hey, you need to release antidiuretic hormone. That antidiuretic hormone gets transported through the blood, so it moves its way to the blood until it finds its target cell. And in this case, it's the adrenal gland here that's on the kidneys, because kidneys are what filter out and either release water to be made into urine, or they absorb it and decrease the amount of urine. So if we're dehydrated, we want to decrease that. So that antidiuretic hormone needs to go to the adrenal gland, there to the kidneys. And once it's on the kidneys, it binds to those receptors on the cell, and then it causes an action. So the action here at the actual specific cells, whenever it binds to the receptor, is that hormone receptor complex triggers a change to the target cell. In this case, it increases vasoconstriction. That leads to higher blood pressure and less water is going to get released. So it stays inside and then again helps relieve that dehydration effect. All right, now our steroid hormones, these are actually going to be working inside of the cell. So again, they all bind to receptors, but sometimes the receptor is inside the cell and sometimes it's on the membrane. Steroid hormones can actually move across the membrane because they are hydrophobic, so they can cross that plasma membrane. So those receptors are going to be inside, either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. So a lot of these are going to alter DNA. So they'll actually go all the way into the nucleus to bind to a receptor. Now these steroids are actually made from cholesterol. So of course cholesterol gets a bad rap. We can have too much, but we need cholesterol because it helps make some of these steroid hormones like estrogen and testosterone. So those hormones, though, again, they pass through the lipid bilayer, so that's why the receptors are inside. They form, once they bind to that receptor, then the majority of them are going to target DNA in the nucleus. So the receptor may be in the cytoplasm, but ultimately it's causing an effect on the DNA inside of the nucleus. And what that does is it activates transcription of a gene, and transcription makes RNA, and then RNA is used to synthesize proteins through translation. So the majority of steroid hormones are increasing or altering gene expression, the production of proteins. So again, how does the cell know it needs to make a specific enzyme or it needs to stop making it? So one of the ways is through this communication. So if we trigger transcription, it produces the protein that then has an effect. Right, this is just kind of a visual here looking at this process. So again, what's happening here in step one, so estrogen in this example is one of our steroid hormones. Again, it is hydrophobic, it's small, so it can move right through the plasma membrane, and it's going to go in, and the receptor for estrogen is actually inside of the nucleus. So it goes through the membrane, but also through the nucleus. And here it's going to find its receptor, and it's going to attach to it. Now, once that receptor protein is attached, and only when it's attached to that hormone, in this case estrogen, now that complex is actually going to bind to the DNA. That binding activates transcription, and transcription is then going to make messenger RNA. It goes out to the ribosomes here and ultimately produces a protein. In this case, it's the progesterone receptor. So then that receptor then goes and is ready to receive another hormone called progesterone. And so this cascade kind of continues. But again, this is mainly just highlighting how steroid hormones work. They go through the plasma membrane, find the receptor, either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. Ultimately, they bind to the DNA to increase transcription, which alters the amount of protein being made. All right, now we have a couple different types. So anabolic steroids, this is what we hear about mainly if you say someone's on steroids. We're talking about anabolic steroids. But understand, again, there are a lot of different steroid hormones in the body that have nothing to do with muscle building or anything like that. So those that are involved in muscle building that we kind of think of with steroids, those are actually anabolic steroids. All right, so what do these actually do? So they are synthetic compounds that resemble the male hormone testosterone. So again, these are synthetic. Our body doesn't make these. Our body makes testosterone, or if you're male. So anabolic steroids, though, are synthetic versions that are meant to activate or act like testosterone. So the injection into muscle cells activates the growth of genes. Again, it binds to the DNA, and that causes more muscle proteins to be produced. And those bigger muscles then lead to increased strength. So again, it's muscle building because it mimics the hormone testosterone that ultimately increases protein production. However, there are a lot of dangerous side effects for both men and women taking them. The worst being liver damage, because again, these kind of come from cholesterol. So again, it can alter the liver, heart disease, again, because they're so closely related to cholesterol, high blood pressure, and then also some psychological disorders and the effects on the brain. And then typically, men experience feminization, so they kind of start decreasing in masculinity, whereas females go the other way. So females become more masculine. So for example, men, their boobs actually increase. So man boobs is kind of a term that goes along with that. They start typically losing their hair, whereas females, they actually start becoming more hairy. Their voice kind of deepens. So again, it kind of has the opposite effect. Men become more feminine, women become more masculine, as some of the other side effects. Again, though, the main dangers are associated though with the liver and the heart. All right, now switching into our peptide hormones. So these are more protein-based hormones instead of steroids. So they cannot cross the membrane because they're hydrophilic. They like water, so they can't go across that bilayer of the cell. So those receptors are going to be embedded in the plasma membrane. Still the same overall goal happens though whenever that hormone binds to the receptor, that changes the receptor on the inside of the cell to kind of change, and it activates what are called second messengers. Okay, so our receptor here is embedded in the membrane. Well, how is it going to do anything inside of the cell? Well, what happens is once the peptide hormone binds to it, and only when it's bind, it's going to activate what's called a second messenger. Then that second messenger activates another messenger, and we have this domino kind of relay effect until ultimately there's some type of alteration, into the cell activity. So there are quite a few different types of second messengers. What they do though is they activate enzymes, and then those enzymes activate other molecules. And again, we kind of have this relay domino effect inside of the cell. And one of the most common, but certainly not the only, second messenger is called cyclic AMP. So we know of ATP, our energy, we have the 3 phosphates. Well, cyclic AMP only has 1 phosphate, and it kind of loops around to where the phosphate and the base are kind of interacting there. So it creates a unique structure. Again, the point though is that the presence of cyclic AMP activates an enzyme. That enzyme activates another protein. That protein activates another one until again some type of change has happened in our cells. All right, so these target cells, so the single hormone binding to the receptor can actually form many second messengers. So we have this kind of amplification process happening. So for example, one receptor may be activated, but it could ultimately produce cyclic AMP, maybe 300 cyclic AMP molecules from that one receptor. So then all of those go and activate lots of enzymes, and then those enzymes activate more and more. So we get, again, this kind of amplification using these second messengers to where the signal ultimately changes the cell, because each second messenger activates many other types of enzymes that activate many other types of enzymes. All right, so if we kind of look at this, how this is all used. So again, here's our receptor embedded in the membrane. Our hormone binds to it. It's called the first messenger because that's actually sending the signal. That's why these other ones involved are called second messengers. Okay, so the hormone is the first one. Everything inside of the cell, though, communicating that is then referred to as a second messenger. Again, it's the relay system. All right, so in this case, the receptor activates an enzyme called adenylyl cyclase. It converts ATP, again, our little energy source, gets rid of 2 of its phosphates and produces a cyclic AMP molecule. Then cyclic AMP goes and activates another enzyme. In this example, it's activating a kinase enzyme. So now it's activated and it's going to go and bind to other proteins or DNA or something that then causes an effect. So again, we get this ultimate relay happening where one protein activates another, that activates another. And so we have these second messengers here that help with that relay system.